On so many levels, in so many ways, Australian music has opened doors for thousands of people that work in the industry and just, lighten people's days.
Jen Jill Brown, welcome to the Australian Music Vault. Jen, now I want you to take us right back to the beginning when you were a teenager and first experiencing Australian live music as opposed to international live music. What was going on in the late 60s when you were becoming a teenager?
In the 60s in Australia, I mainly experienced music through television and radio and to some extent records. But my favourite bands back then were the Loved Ones, who were fantastic. Also, there was Running, Jumping, Standing Still, were a great bluesy-based, gravelly band. There was the Purple Hearts, of course, coming from Brisbane and moving down to Melbourne. The Masters Apprentices moved from Adelaide to Melbourne, and there was this great scene that was quite rhythm and blues based, black influenced, also influenced by the Mersey beat. And there was Python Lee Jackson was one of the first bands I saw live at Q Club. That was located in the Q Civic Centre. At that stage, I wasn't allowed out, so I used to get out the bedroom window at night as a schoolgirl and go and see them. And I saw the Twilights all in their suits doing, do the odd Beatles song, and they did quite a few of their own songs too. But they were a little bit more straight-laced for me. I liked the more earthy, rocky, exciting bands. So they could really get me going, but I didn't get to see nearly as many of those bands live as I would have liked to. Around 1970, 71, I was just out of school. I was going to poetry readings at La Mama. That's the first place I read poetry, and I was very keen to be a writer. And then I saw an ad in a little paper called Daily Planet, which was the kind of rocky answer to Go Set. Go Set was a terrific national success as a pop paper featuring Molly Meldrum and Stan Rofe, the DJ in their kind of war of words and calling each other names and things like that. But it was very pop focused, tremendous as it was, and Michael Gudinski and Michael Browning, who had an agency called Consolidated Rock, they wanted to get something going in opposition to Go Set to publicise their bands that weren't getting a look in, the Chain and, harder rock bands like Madder Lake. And then there were all the bands like Spectrum and the jazz scene. So I saw this Daily Planet and I thought, wow, and I loved it. And they ran a little tiny ad one day looking for freelance writers. So I thought, well, I've never been a journalist, but, I'm a poet, so, why not give it a go? So I went in there and did an interview, and I was interviewed by Broderick Smith, the singer of Carson and then the Dingoes, who used to write a lot about great blues players and different bands and interview people. And he interviewed me, and he sort of said to Adrian Barker, who was also working there, I think as the editor at the time, oh yeah, let's give her a go. So they let me write about, it was a fundraiser for the Pram Factory at the time, which was part of the hub of Carlton's creative theatrical scene, which also involved quite a few musicians, like Martin Armiger and Red Simons working there in little bands, supporting plays and giving soundtracks. And so I wrote about this fundraiser, and that was the first thing that got published in what was then Daily Planet. And after 20 issues, it evolved into Planet. Smoothed out a little bit, became a little bit more cheeky, a bit more like Oz magazine, and very counterculture. We covered Sunbury, we reviewed films, you know, I worked reviewing a whole lot of stuff. John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, I think, was one of the first reviews I did. Led Zeppelin in 1973 at Kooyong, and worked along there. And we had a fantastic gang of the staff were very cooperative, friendly people, mainly in their teens and 20s. There wasn't a lot of female rock journalists per se early on. I was the main one at that time. There were some other women that worked there in the different areas, but the main staff was male, yeah. It started as Daily Planet, lasted about a year, so they came out every week. From, I think it was August 1971 through to July 72, when the last issue was seized by the Victorian Vice Squad, unfortunately, and went down in flames. We didn't have enough money to keep going. I think it was in 1972 that I moved out of home. It was a lovely big old rambling house in Elwood on the edge of St Kilda. And it was inhabited already by Ross Wilson, the progenitor of Daddy Cool, singer, songwriter, frontman, and also Carol Jerams, the photographer, and she was at that time teaching TAFE, and Ian McRae, who was also a filmmaker and ad maker. So we had this fabulous creative household. And I was very blessed to move in there. I think I would have been around about 20. And I was at that time single, but I started dating Greg McCanch. And after a while, he moved in. But it was wonderful. I remember opening the fridge and just seeing film stock in there. And Carol had a fantastic dark room where I used to go in and watch her develop. She did the famous film, or the famous still called Vale Street. There were some photos taken there in the backyard with me and Greg, and also she took some of Shirley Strawn and so on when she was taking photos for the Skyhooks $1 Million Riff book that I wrote, and she took most of the photographs for. So when I hear about some of these terrible share houses these days, I just think how lucky I was to move out of suburban old North Bourne and end up in this beautiful creative household. Yes, I was at the first Sunbury 72 and several Sunburys after that. I think all of them actually. But Sunbury 72 was a total blast. It was very hot, and people were kind of, you know, there was a lot of people taking off their clothes and jumping in the creek. There was just streams and streams of music over days, and it was an absolute feast. I was reporting on Sunbury 72, and I was also looking at how the whole festival was run with John Fowler and Odessa Promotions, who'd kind of come up with the idea after, part of their team had seen what was going on at the first rock festival at Ourimbah, I think it was, yeah. I think it was run amazingly. There was virtually no violence. There was no sort of bad accidents. There was probably, nobody quite knew at the first Sunbury 72 how many people would come, but it was a tremendous turnout. I'm trying to to remember now whether it's about 35,000 people, something like that. I think as a reporter, I approached it in an immersive sense, a more gonzo Hunter S. Thompson sense than keeping it together and keeping records. I'm pretty sure I did take LSD, like quite a lot of people who were there, and so that was just what was happening. It was a happening, and we were happening, and we were all part of it. We were all creating it, and then I would just take all the memories and kind of pour them onto the page, and you knew you had a certain amount of words and your deadline coming up, and somehow it would just magically all come together in time, and the paper would come out and everything would be there in these amazing photographs by David Porter. It was a terrific paper. From memory, I think I did go to all the sundries, and as you can imagine, sometimes with that kind of experience you can get a little bit misty, but I'm pretty sure I went to all of them. And probably the most controversial one, oh no, there were more than one controversial ones, but certainly when Deep Purple played, that was pretty controversial. The main reason being that there was, by that stage, quite a sort of bitch fight going on about who got paid what in the scene, and I was kind of well enough embedded in the music scene to be privy to quite a lot of information about who was getting paid what fees. Deep Purple had, high-scale management and a lot of international success, so they had manoeuvred themselves into a position or been contracted to play at Sunbury for a large fee. And there were a lot of rumblings in the Australian bands about whether or not their fees would get paid at all due to the amount Deep Purple was contracted to play. And Deep Purple came in a helicopter. The weather was bad and the crowds were down, and so there was a bad scene there. And they were also playing at the same time, pretty much as AC/DC, who, of course, were on their route to international success. So I believe what was happening was that Deep Purple was set to headline and AC/DC were on just before them. And AC/DC's crew set up their gear behind Deep Purple's gear. Then Deep Purple's management decided that they want to go on before AC/DC, because I think they were a little bit scared of AC/DC because the band was just, tremendous live. I mean, they were just absolutely slaying the crowds, and they were extremely popular in Australia. And also the weather was very uncertain. But so I think AC/DC's roadies hated this idea, but they did start to accommodate. And then I think Deep Purple changed their minds again. And at that point, a real fistfight came out. One of AC/DC's roadies was Tana, who was a female roadie, and she was a big tough girl, even though she was really quite young. And she got involved in the fight, and Angus got involved in the fight, and so there was all kinds of punches being thrown, and in the end AC/DC packed up and left, and they didn't play, and that was a pretty uproar. And the Australian bands all felt they didn't need Deep Purple. They could draw all these people to Sunbury on their own, and they'd proven that, and they objected. Philip Fraser had started Go Set, and although that had been a tremendous success, he and his fellow Monash University students mainly started that. After a while, they all got a little bit disillusioned because it was great to have this great pop paper, but they were, especially Philip, was a lot more revolutionary. So he and some other people started actually within Go Set a little section called Revolution, which was a little bit more political That turned into a very short-lived paper called Revolution. And as Planet folded, some of the staff of Planet were taken by Philip, including me, into the start of Australian Rolling Stone. I was their first Australian reporter in this little insert. And I remember I did an interview with Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull on their tour out here. And then that developed into putting out the full Rolling Stone with Australian pages within it. Yeah, so that's how Rolling Stone became the first version of Rolling Stone that was published with an original section outside of America, was in Australia, organised by Philip Fraser. Yeah, it was extremely exciting to be asked to do that. I was absolutely thrilled, partly because Philip Fraser, had been someone I'd looked up to for so long, and also because I was a mad fan of Hunter S. Thompson and been following all his, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail and his tremendous writings illustrated by Ralph Steadman there in Rolling Stone, and, the Black Panthers and, great spreads with Annie Leibovitz's pictures of the Rolling Stones and, things like that. And then as Planet folded and that staff became available, some of us went into The Digger, which Philip started as a full-scale political underground journal. There was quite a lot of music in there that I wrote about, and also that I did film reviews, and we had a lot of political reporting. We reported on Bertram Wayner's abortion clinic and, police informers and, all kinds of things that, troubled the establishment. And again, Digger, like Planet, was very troubled by the Victorian Vice Squad, which in those days didn't like four-letter words. It didn't like, very left-wing investigations. I mean, none of us were communists or anything, but quite a few of us were draft dodgers. The counterculture kind of, for me, following that trail through Planet into Digger and Rolling Stone, and at the same time, multitasking and working also for what was Nation Review, and Michael Leunig was working there, Mungo McCallum, and Bob Ellis, and a great raft of writers and ratbags. And so I worked there writing about music too, and also along the way, strangely enough, became their horse racing columnist called Zesta. I was named Zesta by Mick Morris, one of the editors there. I think it was something to do with my zest for life and the way that I approached writing. I think the longer form articles that I write, I actually wrote a pretty good one like that stands up pretty good today, I think, in Digger, that ran through two different issues on the Rolling Stones on their tour here in the early 70s. I think it was 73. And so I kind of embedded in the tour. Peter Rudge, their tour manager, very kindly let me kind of just sit quietly in his room and watch, as he was sort of like the hub of activities with things coming and going. And I went to a few of the shows in Melbourne and went to Sydney and, was allowed to just watch everything that was going on. So I just did a fly on the wall there. So that kind of journalism was so different, because the research you were doing was by embedding. You just telling through your own eyes what you see, a bit more like a documentary film than, do a massive research. Like the research I'd done was just listening to decades of Rolling Stones records. I was allowed into the hotel zone. Like they had I think they were in Melbourne and they were in the Southern Cross, and they had a floor that was sort of all Rolling Stones. So they had a lot of crew and they had a few days. Actually, I first met them, there was a press conference at Montsalvat. So I think it was the day after the press conference was my full moon 21st birthday party. And so I handed out some invitations. And lo and behold, after an extremely wild party where some journalists got thrown into the pool and, you know, there was all kinds of things going on, and Mackenzie Theory, you know, who I adored, were playing, and it was in my parents' house in Northbourne. Then it was, I think, about 3 a.m, a limo pulled up, and out comes Keith Richards and Mick Taylor and Bobby Keys and some of the road crew. And, they came in and they started talking to some of my friends, and my mum was there and she chatted to Mick Taylor about architecture. He was really interested in the architecture of the house, which was co-designed by Robin Boyd and my father. And we had a Japanese garden, so we were kind of hanging out there, and it was really lovely. And then, so that was like 3 or 4 in the morning, and then the next day they had a concert at Kooyong at noon, and it was so hot, you know. It was then Fahrenheit, no, I don't know, it was about 104 degrees or something like that. And Mick Jagger had heat exhaustion, so it was really quite trying. And they had that concert, and then they had a concert that night. And so some of those boys had been out, you know, 4 in the morning. So had I, of course, but I wasn't playing. And then they had to play a concert at noon or so, and then they had to play a concert at night, and then they had a concert the next day on the Sunday, and then Sydney. And so while they were in Melbourne, I think I spent quite a bit of time, you know, in Peter Rudge's room, or they had some other entertainment room, just kind of trying to look cool, you know, and not blush and not be an idiot. I think it was around 73. I was rock journo, doing these different things, and started to see, you know, Skyhooks playing around the place, and Shirley had joined, and that was pretty tremendous. And then I think it was the night that Skyhooks played at the Track Cinema. It was just a little gig, but I think that was the night I started talking to Greg McCainch, and we got on really well, and so we started a relationship and fell in love. And, you know, so I was able to watch Skyhooks' ascension from, you know, just a band playing around martinis and, you know, the different gigs around town, the Tiger Lounge I think they played at, you know, different clubs, work their way up to become this absolute incredible phenomenon. And at the same time, I was a poet still, and I had a book coming out called Marsupial Wrestling, my first poetry book, through Outback Press. Outback Press was an Australian publishing company that was publishing some terrific books. They published a book about Australian women with all the photographs of Carol Jerams and Virginia Fraser doing the text. And they asked me if I would be interested in doing a book about Skyhooks. And Skyhooks were open to this. They knew I was already a rock journalist and knew them all well. So I was able to interview them, and there was a tremendous rush to get the book out for Christmas, I remember that. So it was probably written in about 5 months. But Carol Jerams again came to the fore and did some tremendous photographs. And so this little fan book came out, and it sold 20,000 copies. It was a huge hit. And so that was in 1975. So to write the book, it was, you know, very much a labour of love. I started with a timeline, so just following through the different musicians that had contributed to the bands leading up to Skyhooks, their DNA in a sense. So that was in the front. I had some lyrics. I had fan letters. Some of the fans wrote these crazy letters and did drawings, so we put some of them in to just make it a real Skyhooks experience. And I interviewed all the members. They were fantastic. They were all very easy to talk to. I guess the thing that Skyhooks did most, apart from their kind of brash up yours qualities, you know, wearing lots of makeup and glitter and platforms and, you know, really whatever they damn well liked. And if people wanted to call them names, well, they would talk back. You know, they would heckle pretty damn good. They were, I guess, very renowned for having a set of songs that were completely locally Australian-based, even suburban in Melbourne, you know, with Baldwin calling. A lot of people ask if that was about me, but it wasn't, no, luckily. Turak Cowboy, Sunsets over Carlton, you know, the tremendous local content, and it really painted the scenes and the characters of the day, and the songs were quirky and, you know, they had all kinds of quirky little riffs and strange ways of writing, but somehow it all worked as a package and it was tremendously exciting. And also live, they were good musos and they could really carry it off. They were very sweaty, hard, tough, tight, you know, they were a great band. So they carried it off with an aplomb that really saved Mushroom from bankruptcy for sure, and, you know, allowed them to carry on and record so many other great Australian bands, and you know, really opened up the scene, following on from Daddy Cool, who'd done a tremendous job too, you know, evolving from doo-wop into a very Australian way of music as well, with individual songs and tremendous live shows. So in 1978, I had a big change of life. Greg and I broke up, and I met Todd Hunter and fell in love with him. And also, leading up to that, I'd been working for Nation Review amongst other papers, and they'd actually offered me a B-grade journalism qualification, which was a big deal for somebody who, you know, at that point hadn't even finished high school. At that time, I turned it down, and then after my personal life changed, I decided I would move to Sydney, and that's where Todd was living with his band Dragon. And we actually met when I did a story and interviewed Mark, his brother. So I moved to Sydney, and, you know, that was marvellous. I'd been to Sydney beforehand and just been swept away by what a kind of vibrant place it was, and Sydney seemed to have this kind of loose, gregarious outdoor life that was very appealing. And so Todd and I moved in together, and it wasn't a very long-lasting relationship, but it was a very influential one. We wrote a lot of songs together, and both of us were, I think, you know, getting to know what that might mean for me with my poetry background, being drawn more towards lyrics, but having all kinds of ideas about music and production and arrangements, and Todd being obviously the musician who, you know, had his Porter studio and his tapes and was working on becoming a producer. So demoing things, singing, you know, he was also a brilliant singer himself, mainly as a backing singer in Dragon, rather than a lead vocalist, but was wonderful. And so we worked on a range of songs, some more successful than others. We had a great time doing it, and a couple of them ended up on O Zambezi, one of Dragon's records. I really loved that band, you know, like as human beings and as a musical outfit. So moving to Sydney, obviously I had to make a bit of a living. I had first written for RAM in 75. Then I started writing for RAM more often, and also for Nation Review, which also had a Sydney office. And so I kind of launched into being pretty much a full-time freelance rock writer, and particularly for those two. I was like a big regular for those two, but I would occasionally do a feature on someone for Playboy, or, you know, Lamb, which was a London music paper, things like that. I was genuinely freelancing. And it was a fascinating time. The scene was booming. I was lucky that the scene actually went from the boom that had been in Melbourne in the 70s through to Sydney, where these big leagues clubs were just being absolutely inhabited by some of the tremendous bands that were coming out of Sydney at that time. There was the Dirty Pool Agency, which was very much in competition with Gudinski's Premier Artists, and Harbour Agency in Sydney and Melbourne and Sydney. They had Ice House, well, that started as Flowers, became Ice House. They had the Angels, which started as Angel City, came over from Adelaide and turned into the Angels. They had Cold Chisel, who came over from Adelaide, and they had the connections with Midnight Oil, who had their own independent agency going through Gary Morris and their own record company, Powderworks. So there was a tremendous, and they had INXS too, Dirty Pool. So these bands were so entertaining and became so polished. They would, you know, work out their own supports, and, you know, they'd introduce a band like Numbers, and, you know, they'd built themselves up. Rat Cat, you know, there was this big independent scene happening in Sydney, which grew right away from the whole mushroom scene, and started record companies like Rue Art, and, you know, there was Martin Fabini's Regular Records, which had the Reels, and, you know, the Mental as Anything. They were also going through Dirty Pool. So there was a really powerful money-making scene going on with some very creative acts, very much in contrast to the Melbourne scene, which had been dominant in Australia before then. So RAM was Rock Australia magazine, and it was started by Anthony O'Grady with his co-publisher Philip Mason, who was more the straight businessman, the accountant, and you know, director from that side of affairs, whereas Anthony was the hands-on creative editor and commissioning editor, and he gathered up some different lost souls who wanted to write about rock and music. There was me. There was Annie Burton was somebody who wrote in and became a really powerful writer. And there was Andrew McMillan, who came from Brisbane. He wrote a letter in as a schoolboy, wrote a concert review of Status Quo, I think it was, that caught the eye of Anthony O'Grady, and he published it. There were writers like Mark Mordew and many of the, you know, Clinton Walker, the writers that are so well known today, cut their teeth on RAM, and it was a tremendous publication. It was a big colour spread, ambitious. It sold all throughout Australia. It sold big numbers. It was a commercial success. RAM would write about all kinds of things that you could put in a big article. You could write about unemployment, you know, drug problems, all kinds of things that counterculture and youth were interested in. It wasn't a revolutionary type of paper. It wasn't a political paper. but it was gritty and you could spread out. I did early stories on INXS, Mental as Anything, Mondo Rock cover story. So, you know, it was a tremendous music paper, the likes of which we really miss today. You know, today's publishing world has changed so much, and the vibrant independent papers that I was so fortunate to write for through the 70s and 80s are best, you know, the best reflection would be the monthly or also the Saturday paper that Maurice Schwartz publishes. He's carried on that independent publishing crown, but there's otherwise, you know, the big Murdoch papers and Fairfax have sort of gobbled up a lot of papers, and the free press came out and laid waste to the RAM model, really, where people were getting much inferior journalism, but they were getting the gig guides and it was free and they'd get it at all the venues, and those independent publications were really challenged by the street press that sort of swamped the scene and took a lot of the advertising, and, you know, things march on, but it would be lovely to see somehow, you know, a big publication that would cover so much in depth on the beautiful music that's around today in the teens, the 20 teens, and it's not there. So after a while, RAM was a bit of a struggle, and some of the RAM writers got a bit fed up, you know, with waiting around on Friday for a cheque to finally come through. And I was one of those. So I did a few other things. I was working with Don Walker from Cold Chisel's Burdekin Music. I helped him set up his own independent publishing company. And that was involved in recording the soundtrack to Freedom. Things like that. But I also decided that I would try and apply for a job that I heard from one of my friends was coming up, which is a job in music publishing company called professional manager. That's like an A&R manager is in a record company in many ways. So you're a talent scout, you're listening to a lot of music on, you know, in those days it was cassettes. Looking for talent, you're going out to see bands, you're trying to find writers in particular, songwriters. Some of them will be more behind the scenes professional songwriters rather than rock stars. But in a lot of times the two things that go together. And I heard this job was coming up in a company which was MCA Gilby Proprietary Limited, which is Music Corporation of America, which had grown out of Leeds Music, which was a very big company which had signed up Elton John early on. Yeah, when he was Reggie Dwight. And so they had a lot of his catalogue, and they also had some tremendous things like Sam Cooke and some beautiful old songs. They also had the copyright to Baby Please Don't Go, which ended up on the B-side of an AC/DC single, and it was like the most blistering, amazing version of Baby Please Don't Go that I ever heard, because I was a big AC/DC fan and sort of saw them from their early days. And so I used to blast that out in the office. So I was very, very lucky to get the job. I remember I beat 30 people, including a lawyer, and I was incredibly proud of myself because it was my first straight job, my first 9-to-5 job. And of course, there's a lot of after hours as well, but I think my background in independent music publishing had helped. Before I'd worked with Burdekin, I'd also run Payola Music, which had my songs with Todd Hunter. I'd run a little company called Propaganda Music, which Beverly Patterson, who'd worked with Gudinski, And Megan Tudor had the daughter of Ron Tudor, who they had this tremendous publicity company called Propaganda, and they started a music publishing company, and they put me in charge of running that. So I'd learnt the ropes, and I knew about music publishing as well as having a really good grasp of the scene and a lot of contacts. So I guess those things helped me get the job at MCA Gilby, and it was tremendous. Chris Gilby was the Gilby involved, and he'd had a connection with the Saints and the church through management. And, you know, the two of the bands that I had the most respect for in the whole music business creatively, he had a lot to impart. And he'd come into the office every morning, just absolute ball of energy. He's got an American background, and he just bigger than life. So he'd just sell the hell out of whatever it was that was playing at full volume in our meeting room first thing in the morning. I loved working there, and while we were there, we signed The Change, who became Noiseworks, and INXS to a very big deal, which was a worldwide deal, which was quite hard to talk Leeds Levy into, because I think Chris Murphy, the INXS's manager, is while he was a tremendous manager, he was also very abrasive and tough. And so Leeds wasn't too taken with him, but I remember, you know, saying, you know, look, Leeds, I think this band is tremendous. They've got a big future. All the members are so talented and they're hardworking, and they haven't changed their lineup. And, you know, they've got so much talent, and Michael's this huge star and the music's great. So, you know, give it a go. And so I think they got $100,000 advance, and that funded their first international tour. So that was wonderful, you know, having that connection. So it was a great professional music publishing company, and I managed to, you know, go on some overseas conferences and go to Cannes, you know, Medium seminar on music publishing rights, and it was a great education in music. When I started working in the music industry, there weren't many women. There were very few even lead singers in bands. There was Renee Gayer and, you know, very few others. You know, people would struggle to kind of think, who can we talk about? There was Wendy Saddington, there was a range of pop singers, you know, the ones that came out of young talent time, like Deborah Byrne and so on. And then when punk came along, that opened the doors to a whole lot of musicians in Stiletto, for instance, in Melbourne, you know, fronted by Jane Clifton. There were, you know, for the first time, you know, more than one musician was a woman. More and more women coming from doing publicity or working in publishing companies. It was always hard for them to become a managing director. There's still very, very little around like that. There's still a glass ceiling for a lot of women in music, as there is in other industries. But women have permeated the scene and have earned great respect throughout all levels of the music industry in Australia. It's very normal to see women spoken to and respected. But we still face problems today. For instance, there's been a bit of a push about trying to tackle sexual assault in venues. The way rape is and sexual assault is so often hidden, and child abuse has been, just general groping and, you know, the odd sexual assault that people think is just something you can brush off is still quite chronic, as well as the sidelining often of women who can be a little less pushy in promoting their cause or putting themselves on the top of the bill. So we still have a way to go to make venues safe for women and to completely be equal with men in terms of power, money and influence. But it's certainly the music business has come a long way. I think that in the music industry there are many types of careers, and some of them are, you know, engineering and behind the desk production. I know when I did some production on that 0 to 9 series for the ABC, I didn't know of any other women producers in Australia. And in some respects, I wished I'd followed that harder because I love the studio. But I'd been encouraged by Mark Opitz, and I'd been able to sit back and watch Cold Chisel record all of East after watching the Freedom soundtrack go down, and he'd let me use sliders and he'd, you know, ask what I thought about this and that and the other, when I had no right to do that. But I think he nurtured someone like me, and you need those people to nurture you. So I hope that men in positions of control will continue to nurture women and teach them and let them feel this isn't something they're held out of, those technical jobs. I do think women are losing a fear of being perhaps not as good as men at doing technical things. And that's a generalisation because, of course, a lot of them never had that fear, and good on them. They shouldn't do. In terms of recognition of women in the industry, yeah, I think there's still quite a long way to go. I don't know what's behind it. It's one of those really subtle things in society that you feel it, but you can't put your finger on how it happens. It's in language, it's in names, it's a funny thing. Yeah, it does permeate, but I feel that we have a culture which is allowing women to flower and to come out and be everything that they could be here, and they need to take those opportunities and just step into the fray. So it would have been around 85, I got an offer from Gary Ashley and Michael Gudinski to join the Mushroom team. So I'd known the Mushroom history quite well, obviously through my connection with Skyhooks, and also I think I was one of the very first writers writing little bios for the bands at Mushroom. That was a bit of a history I had of just writing, you know, the little one-page amount of writing that would go out to people who needed to know about the group. And the other thing I'd do, apart from the talent scout type of things, would be pitching songs. So, you know, I got Jimmy Barnes to record Change Is Gonna Come, the Sam Cooke song, you know, and was having some success getting cover versions. So Gudinski wanted me for the two sides, the record company and the publishing company. So I became the first A&R manager of Mushroom Records and Publishing. So that was a great honour. I was Sydney-based, which I think was also good for them in those days because they were Melbourne-based. There was so much going on in Sydney, they wanted somebody there to be an A&R eye. And when Michael came to Sydney on his frequent visits, to go out with him and look at some bands and so on. So that was tremendous. I mean, it was a lot more, how do you say, make it up as you go along. That was the Mushroom creed. There wasn't no one was trained in management. No one knew how to manage people. No one knew how to do anything, but it was just like, let's do it. One thing I learned from Michael was if you get an idea, you do it straight away. It's a great idea. It's a great creative tool. And the enthusiasm of the company, you know, Michelle Higgins and Michael were great sales tools for getting records into radio. I mean, they were just fantastic at taking new records around to radio stations and, you know, being so enthusiastic, and, you know, the other people involved at the radio stations with their jaded, often views of getting flogged all this material would just get caught up in the enthusiasm, and they'd start playing machinations or, you know, whatever it was, models that got taken in that day. So, you know, there were some real stars on the staff, and they all played their parts. There was a lot of politics, which was, you know, painful at times. It was very stressful. It was long hours. It was crazy hours. It was sort of like probably most people would start around 10 and then they'd go through till 6 every day and sometimes 7, and then they'd go out, you know, they'd see bands. Like particularly I had to do that, so I'd be doing that every weekend as well as through the week. It was also musically, it was quite a golden age, which was part of the reason I was so attracted to joining Mushroom at that time. Some people were a bit cynical about me leaving MCA Gilby, and certainly I was extremely grateful for everything I'd learnt there, but I was just thought with a record company you could just have just that little bit extra influence. So the bands that came to Mushroom or were working at Mushroom, Paul Kelly was there, and one of the jobs that I had so many jobs as A&R manager. One of them was overseeing the clips, the film clips. So, for instance, To Her Door was one of the clips that happened there, where Claudia Castle was the director, and, you know, different directors would be pitching to do the job. They'd come in, they'd storyboard, you know, we'd discuss the storyboard, and that'd be approved with the budget. And then, you know, they'd go through, and I'd go along while they were shooting, and they shot a lot of that in this beautiful old collapsing mansion in Darlinghurst, which is right near our office, which was perched looking over William Street with all the traffic streaming towards the Coke sign in King's Cross, right near Double J, which became, you know, Triple J. And this was a great old set, and Claudia did a fantastic job. That ended up winning an ARIA for Paul. The Triffids came across from Perth, and we put out their records in Australia, and, you know, from In the Pines, and Born Sandy Devotional, which was, you know, the producer was organised through Mushroom, and we played key roles in helping the Triffids, and we're always quite heartbroken that they never enjoyed a lot of chart success, even though they've become lasting legends of the scene. There was the Go-Betweens, had a similar situation where, you know, they had their own independent background and connections in London, but also benefited from, you know, the enthusiasm of Mushroom and the marketing, and they used to come in and see me as well as the Triffids. You know, I'd be kind of the point of contact, and always be so entertaining to have the Go-Betweens in the office. You know, they're so, Robert and Lindy, so tall and intellectual and witty, and so much musical talent with Amanda Brown and Grant, and, you know, very sad to lose him so early. But their other main songwriter, you know, along with Robert Forster. But yeah, so the Grant McLennan and Robert Forster connection in the Go-Betweens was one of the things that made them a great band for Mushroom to represent. The Johnnies was a sort of like dirty rock and roll band that did quite well around the scene. Models became huge with James Freud coming across from Teenage Radio Stars. And who else did we have? Like Paul Kelly became gradually huger and huger off this incredibly pathetic base of sales, with his huge determination. So that was wonderful. The church was a signing that I was behind. Yeah, Gudinski swept into the office one day and said, "Who can we steal that's with somebody else, you know? What's some established band we can get?" And I said, "What about the church? You know, they're at EMI, they're just part of the wallpaper there." Mushroom was very much part of, you know, helping pry them away from EMI and helping negotiate that. And then they put out Starfish, which became so enormous and, you know, around the world under the Milky Way had such a huge success. But there's always a joy to work with the church. Jethro Yindi was the band that I'm most proud of, working with at Mushroom and discovering. Alan James, the manager, he came to me one day and said, "Would you be interested in a band that's got a couple of the Swamp Jockeys in it, but it's an Aboriginal band from the top end, and the lead singer is a headmaster at the local school?" And I said, "Oh, definitely." So that's how Jethro Yindi came to be signed. And I was very pleased to, you know, have their first record, Homeland Movement, with the second side of the record all in language. And they were a Yolnu band, and they had to get special permission for the sort of sand patterns on the front and things like that. So you had to learn some new ways of working with an Indigenous band, and connected them with Les Karski, who I knew had been working with Midnight Oil, to record very independently with him to do their first album. And then they struck up the relationship with Midnight Oil, and they ended up touring America with Midnight Oil. And then Paul Kelly co-wrote with Dr. Unipingu, and they wrote Treaty, and that got a dance remix, and the whole thing kind of went off in a direction beyond the introductory time I spent with them. But I feel, you know, very proud of their achievements and everything they were able to do, and to see Dr. Unipingu become Australian of the Year, and to always be a voice for Treaty was a tremendous thing. So after my time at Mushroom finished, you know, it was just, for me, it was time to move on. And I worked for a short while as a music consultant, just seeing young bands and artists wanting advice about what to do. I also worked for a while for the ABC in a couple of different roles. Then I went to Brisbane, had 2 kids, and stayed there for 8 years, and then came back to Melbourne, at which time I was approached one day to hear tragic news that Shirley Strawn, a singer of Skyhooks, had passed away in a helicopter accident. So the Sydney Morning Herald was saying, "Could you please write an obituary?" So it felt a bit like a crow picking over the bones, but I came to realise how important obituaries are and how much they mean to people who care. And so I came to really feel this was a great thing to do, and I've written quite a few obituaries of different people in the arts since then. And that led me to interviewing for the National Film and Sound Archive, and also writing some material and questions for RockWiz. So it's been a terrific time for me over the past few years, working more or less, I guess, as a rock historian and writer, and working on some personal projects and books. I think what started as a low music form or a low cultural idea, which was rock and roll, which my father used to describe as that jive music with disgust, has turned out to be the most wonderful art form. as something I'm so pleased that I've followed, and fought to follow as a young teenager, being forbidden to go out, crawling out those windows and getting involved and spending my whole life getting to know some of the most magic music that the world's ever produced. The music scene in Australia is one of the most powerful in the world, and I'm so proud and happy to see the success it's had over the years after its early struggles in the 60s and 50s to try and even get to knock on the door of some of the places that could show them and, let them in and let them have a go, to being just accepted part of the world touring industry. On so many levels, in so many ways, Australian music has opened doors for thousands of people that work in the industry, and just, lighten people's days. Watching Countdown just makes you weak, when you're in that frame of mind and sit down there at 6 p.m. on Sunday in those days when Countdown ran. Just feel good, just let off the steam, let everything go, have a scream, have a headbang, whatever it is that you like to do with music, sit back with headphones, It's a wonderful pleasure, and it's a great industry these days. It doesn't have to bow down to anyone. It doesn't have to be world class. It's Australian music.